A 13-year-old girl was thrown from a moving wagon in the middle of the Arizona desert and left to die. No water, no shoes, no one coming back. The woman who did it wasn't a stranger. She was the only family Clara had left. And she didn't just abandon her, she planned it, every detail, every mile, every lie. What happens next will make you question how much one child can survive, and what it truly costs a broken man to save her. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Stay with me. This one goes all the way. The buzzards found her before anyone else did. There were 3 of them at first, circling high and lazy in the white-hot sky above the Sonoran Flats, riding the thermals with a patience that had nothing to do with hurry. By the time the 4th one joined the spiral, Clara Whitmore had already been walking for 2 hours in the wrong direction, and she didn't know it yet. She knew other things, though. She knew her feet were blistered through the thin soles of her Sunday shoes, the ones Evelyn had told her to wear that morning, which should have been the first warning, because Evelyn never cared what Clara looked like on ordinary days. She knew her mouth tasted like copper and chalk, the way it always tasted when she'd been crying for too long and the tears finally dried up and stopped coming. She knew the sun was directly overhead, which meant she hadn't been walking long enough for it to matter. Not out here, not in this kind of heat, where the ground itself seemed to breathe fire back up at you through the cracked red dirt. And she knew that the wagon wasn't coming back. She'd known it about 20 minutes after she'd been put off it. Maybe sooner. The moment Evelyn had said, with that particular flatness in her voice, not angry, not even cold, just empty, "Get out and wait here, girl. I need to check the back wheel." And Clara, 13 years old, and 3 years deep into learning exactly how much trouble questioning Evelyn Graves could bring, had climbed down without a word. She'd stood on the road and watched the wagon roll forward, expecting it to slow and stop after a few yards, then after a few more. Then she'd watched the dust cloud thicken behind it as the horses picked up, not slowed down, and the shape of the wagon grew smaller in that shimmering heat haze until she couldn't tell anymore where the wagon ended and the desert began. She'd stood there for a while even after it was gone. Just stood. The way you do when your mind refuses to catch up to what your eyes have already understood. She left. She actually left. It wasn't the first time Evelyn had done something that hurt. After Clara's father, Thomas Whitmore, died of a fever 2 winters ago, Evelyn had wasted about 6 weeks on a performance of grief before she dropped it entirely and gotten back to being exactly who she always was underneath. Calculating, impatient, and quietly vicious in the way that leaves no marks you can point to. The slaps were rare. It was the other things that wore you down. The food withheld for mistakes. The sleep interrupted for pointless chores at 2 in the morning. The words, always the words, clumsy, useless, burden, stupid girl, delivered in that flat voice, not cruel enough to sound cruel, just certain enough to lodge themselves under your skin and stay. But this was something else. Clara pulled herself forward one more step through the heat and tried to think clearly. The road, if you could call it that, it was more of a wheel-rutted gap through the scrub, stretched east and west with equal emptiness. She didn't know which direction they'd come from. Evelyn had given her the sleeping powder in her water the night before. Clara was almost sure of it now. She'd woken in the wagon already moving, already far from anything she recognized, her head thick and her tongue clumsy in her mouth. Planned. The word sat in her chest like a stone. Evelyn had planned this. She thought about her father then, because she usually did when things got bad enough. Thomas Whitmore had been a lean, quiet man with rough hands and a low laugh, and he'd smelled like pine resin and horse sweat, and when Clara was small, she used to fall asleep against his arm on the front porch and feel completely, unreasonably safe. He'd taught her 3 things worth knowing, he always said: how to work without complaining, how to be still when stillness was smarter than moving, and this: one step, then the next. That's all anything ever is, Clara Bird. One step, then the next. She took a step. The ground was broken and pale, scattered with brittle bush and the occasional claw of a cholla cactus that looked dead, but wasn't. The mountains in the distance were a smear of purple-gray, real as a painting and just about as useful. No buildings, no smoke, no sound except the dry wind and, far up above her, the patient unhurried turning of the buzzards. She didn't look up at them. She walked. By the time the sun had moved enough to tell her it was mid-afternoon, her legs had gone from hurting to simply heavy, like something waterlogged and remote that she was towing behind her rather than walking on. The Sunday shoes had given up pretending they fit about an hour back, and were now just leather cases for two swollen masses of pain at the ends of her ankles. She'd taken them off for a while and tried barefoot, but the ground was hot enough to actually burn, so she'd put them back on and kept going. She hadn't found water. She'd looked. She knew dimly that in the desert you were supposed to follow dry washes downhill, because sometimes they had water at the low points, and she'd tried that twice, following the sandy cuts down into shallow basins that were cracked and white and completely empty. She'd broken open a piece of cactus with a rock at one point and gotten a mouthful of something so bitter and thick she'd spit it out immediately and spent the next 10 minutes feeling her stomach revolt. She was learning, in real time and at significant cost, how little she actually knew about surviving. The thing that kept her moving, she'd think about this later, years later, and still not have a clean answer, wasn't courage exactly. It was more like stubbornness. A deep, almost animal refusal to lie down and let the desert take her, while Evelyn Graves was still out there somewhere, still breathing, probably already calculating what to do with what she'd stolen. Clara didn't know exactly what that was yet. She was 13. She knew that her father had left her something. He'd told her so, quietly, on one of his last coherent days when the fever was still letting him surface. But she hadn't known what it was, and Evelyn had made sure she didn't find out. Whatever it is, it's enough to kill me for. The thought had teeth. She let it have them because anger was fuel and she was running low on everything else. She crested a small rise in the ground, barely a rise, just enough to see farther, and looked out across the flat in every direction. Same scrub, same pale distance. The road was behind her now, or at least she thought it was. She'd drifted off it at some point without meaning to, following the wash, and now there was nothing that looked like anything made by people in any direction. Her legs stopped holding her. It wasn't a decision. They just stopped. She sat down hard in the dirt, right there, her dress filthy to the waist, her hair plastered flat with dried sweat. She put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She'd already established that her body had decided it couldn't spare the water for that. She just breathed through her palms and tried to think, but thinking had gotten difficult. Her head felt full of something hot and syrupy that kept getting in the way of thoughts. One step, then the next. "I can't," she said, out loud, to no one. The wind moved the brittle bush around her. One step, then the next. "There's nowhere to step to," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. And that was somehow the most humiliating part of the whole day, cracking on a word, alone, in the middle of the empty desert, talking to a dead man who couldn't hear her. She sat there for what might have been 5 minutes or 20. Then she put one hand in the dirt, pushed, and stood up. She walked. She didn't know how much later it was when she found the dry creek bed that had a little, not much, just a little, muddy water pooled in the shadow of an overhang of red rock. She dropped to her knees and drank without thinking, without caring about the silt taste or the heat of it or the fact that it was probably not clean. It stayed down. That felt like a victory. She drank until her stomach ached, and then she sat with her back against the rock and let the shade cover her for a while. The shade was moving, though. Afternoon, the sun was tilting west. How long until dark? She didn't know. She knew the desert at night got cold, cold enough to kill you just as dead as the heat, just differently. She had no blanket. Nothing but the dress she was wearing, which was cotton and thin. She thought about staying by the water and waiting for someone to find her. She turned that over for a while, testing it. Who would be looking? Nobody in Evelyn's direction, that was for certain. Maybe nobody at all. She thought about the road, how far behind her it was, whether there was any reason to think anyone would come down it, even if she made it back. She didn't know. She got up and started walking again. The last hour before she went down was the worst. Not because of the pain, which had by that point organized itself into a kind of dull, continuous background roar that she'd stopped having opinions about. Not even because of the thirst, which had come back worse after the silt water. Her body apparently wanting more now that it had remembered what water was. It was the sound she heard in her own head, not her father's voice anymore, or at least not only that. Something quieter and more persuasive that kept suggesting, gently, that lying down was reasonable. That she'd walked far enough and nobody was coming, and the ground here was flat and relatively smooth, And it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to just rest for a little while. Just for a little while. She stopped walking. She hadn't meant to. She was standing in the middle of a long, flat stretch of nothing, the road nowhere visible. The mountains still that same useless purple smear. The sun finally starting its drop toward the horizon, which just meant the colors were getting stranger, the shadows longer, the heat mixing now with the first edge of the coming cold. A sound reached her, or she thought it did. Some far-off soft percussion, a kind of rhythmic thud that her brain took a long moment to identify as hoofbeats. She didn't trust it. She thought it was probably her mind making things up, which she'd read about, people lost in deserts hearing things. But she turned toward it anyway, or toward where she thought it was coming from, and she squinted through the haze and the angled evening light. There was something out there, a dark shape, moving, too large for a coyote. A horse, maybe. She opened her mouth to call out, but what came out was barely a sound, just a dry scrape of air across damaged vocal cords. She waved. She put her arms up and waved both of them in broad, sweeping arcs, the way her father had shown her you signal when you're in trouble, big and slow and unmistakable. The shape kept moving toward her or past her, she couldn't tell. Her legs gave out. This time it was a decision, or maybe it wasn't. The line between choosing to go down and falling down had blurred past any useful distinction. She went to her knees and then sat back in the dirt, and the world tilted slightly to one side, and she put her hand out to steady herself against nothing. One step, she thought, and the thought had no energy behind it anymore. Then the next. The hoofbeats got louder. She didn't have the strength to look up. Silas Boone almost didn't ride that direction. He'd been heading back toward the eastern pasture to check on the fence line. His hand, Hector, had reported broken that morning, and the eastern pasture was north of where he was now, not south. He had no reason to come south. The afternoon was already burning off, and he wanted to get home before dark. Wanted his boots off, and something hot in his stomach, and about 6 hours of sleep before tomorrow started. But there'd been something about the buzzards. He'd been watching them off and on for the last hour. 4 of them, then 5, working that tight circular pattern that meant something on the ground was still warm. Usually that was a deer, sometimes a calf. He'd made a habit, years back, of checking on buzzard circles when he had time, because you never knew, and in this country you never knew was a management philosophy as much as a saying. He turned his horse south. He found her about a quarter-mile in, sitting collapsed in the dirt with her arms down and her head bowed, a small dark shape in the long evening shadows that his brain first registered as a bundle of discarded clothing before he registered the hands. The small, pale hands. What in the... He pushed his horse forward and was off before it had fully stopped, and then he was crouching in the dirt beside her and getting his first clear look at her face. Sunburned raw, lips cracked to bleeding, eyes half open in a kind of dazed, unfocused stare that he recognized from bad places he'd been in his life and had hoped never to see again. A child. Not even close to grown. A girl. Hey! He put his hand on her shoulder, not gentle exactly. He wasn't sure gentle would reach her. Hey, look at me. Her eyes moved, slowly, like they had to travel some distance to get to his face. You hurt anywhere? Did you fall from something? Is there... He stopped asking questions because she clearly wasn't in a state to answer them. Her lips moved. He leaned in closer. Water, she said. It was barely a sound. Yeah, I got that. He had 2 canteens. He unstopped the first one and held it to her mouth and tipped it very slightly and watched her swallow, once, twice, stop, swallow again. Her hands came up after a moment and gripped the canteen from underneath, not taking it from him, just holding on to it, and that grip, tight and desperate and exactly the grip of someone who'd spent serious time today not knowing if they were going to make it, hit him somewhere in the chest he'd thought was reasonably well fortified. Slow, he said, small sips. Too much too fast will make you sick. She slowed. She looked at him over the edge of the canteen, eyes gradually sharpening, and something he saw in them gave him an uncomfortable feeling. Not fear. He was used to people being afraid of him. He was a big man, weathered and not exactly soft-looking, and strangers in difficult situations were usually afraid. This wasn't quite fear. It was something more like the look of someone doing rapid calculations, trying to figure out the angle, trying to understand what this new danger was and how to handle it. She's waiting for something bad, he thought, waiting for the other shoe. He sat back on his heels and let her have the canteen and looked out across the flat while she drank, giving her a moment without his face 6 inches from hers. "They're a town nearby," she said after a while. Her voice was still rough but functional. "Closest is Ridgecross, about 12 miles east." A pause. "How far's the road?" "Maybe half-mile north of here." Another pause. He could feel her thinking, that careful, deliberate thinking of someone who'd learned not to trust the obvious answer. "You got family around here?" he asked. "Somebody expecting you?" The silence went a beat too long. "No," she said, flat, no elaboration. He looked at her then, took in the whole picture. The Sunday shoes, 3 sizes wrong for desert walking, worn through and blood-stained. The cotton dress, completely wrong for the weather. The way she was sitting, stiff and contained, keeping her back straight even now, like somebody had beaten the instinct to slump right out of her. Her hands, he noticed, had old marks on them, pale lines across the knuckles, the kind you get from hitting floors or walls or rough work done without enough time to heal. He'd been a rancher his whole life. He knew what animals looked like when they'd been mistreated for a long time. He knew the specific kind of careful they developed, that watchfulness, that habit of making yourself small without appearing to. "How'd you end up out here?" he asked. The pause was longer this time. "I was traveling," she said. "Something happened to the wagon." He looked at her Sunday shoes again. He looked at her hands. He looked at the single canteen she was holding onto like it might be taken from her. "You got a name?" he said. "Clara." She said it like she was deciding whether to give it, and gave it anyway. "Clara." He nodded. "Silas Boone. I run a cattle operation about 7 miles southwest of here, Boone Hollow Ridge." He looked at the sky, the angle of the light. "It's going to be cold tonight. Real cold. I can take you to Ridgecross if that's where you want to go, but that's 12 miles and it's getting late and I don't know what you've got waiting for you there." He paused. "Or you can come back to the ranch, get a proper meal and a bed and some time to heal up those feet, and we figure out the rest tomorrow." She was watching him with that calculating look, that careful measuring look. "Why?" she said. The question surprised him, though it probably shouldn't have. "Why what?" "Why would you do that? You don't know me." Silas looked out at the horizon for a moment. The sun was going down properly now, painting the sky in colors that had no names, and the desert was starting to give back all the heat it had spent the day soaking up. "No," he said, "I don't." He didn't say anything else. He didn't have a clean answer to the question, not one that would make sense to a 13-year-old girl in the circumstances. The true answer involved things he didn't talk about with strangers, or really with anyone. A room in his house that had been closed for 4 years. A pair of boots still sitting beside the back door. The particular way the buzzards had been circling. He stood up and held out his hand. Clara looked at it. She looked at his face. She did that rapid internal calculation again, and he could see her doing it, and he didn't try to rush her. She took his hand and he pulled her to her feet. She made no sound when she stood, though the way her jaw clenched told him it cost her something. He brought his horse around and helped her up into the saddle and then swung up behind her and turned the horse southwest. She didn't lean against him, not at first. She held herself stiffly upright in front of him, maintaining that careful distance, that habit of not asking for anything from anyone. But the horse's motion was rhythmic, and the warmth of another person behind her was probably more than her body could argue with for very long. And about a mile in, her spine softened almost imperceptibly, and her head dropped just slightly, just a fraction, toward the arm he had out to hold the reins. He didn't say anything about it. He just rode. Boone Hollow Ridge was not a pretty place, particularly coming in at dusk. It was a functional place, the kind of ranch built by someone who cared a lot about what worked and not much about what looked nice. The main house was 2 stories, wood-framed, unpainted, with a wide porch that faced south and caught the prevailing winds. The bunkhouse and the stables were set back to the east, and the cookhouse was connected to the main house by a covered walkway that had been put there specifically so you didn't have to go outside to get to dinner in the winter, which told you something about the man who'd designed it. Lights were on in the cookhouse. As Silas brought his horse through the gate, a stout woman appeared at the cookhouse door, wiping her hands on an apron, squinting out at them in the low light. Silas Boone, you are 40 minutes past when I said dinner would be ready, she said. Her voice carried the particular authority of someone who had been feeding people for decades and intended to continue doing so on her own schedule. Rosa. He dismounted and reached up to help Clara down. I found someone who needed help. Rosa Morales was in her mid-50s, with iron gray hair pinned back tightly, and the kind of face that showed every expression it had ever made, deeply and permanently. She looked at Clara, really looked at her, in the way that takes in everything at once, and her expression shifted from irritation to something else entirely without passing through any intermediate stage. Ay, Dios mío. She came off the porch in 3 steps. Come here, mija. Come here. Let me look at you. Clara stood still while Rosa took her face in both hands and tilted it toward the light and looked at the sunburn and the cracked lips and the eyes that were still a little unfocused at the edges. She stood still while Rosa's gaze moved down to the shoes and stayed there for a moment. Those feet need attention, Rosa said. It was not a question. They're fine, Clara said immediately. They are not fine. Rosa's tone was matter-of-fact and entirely not unkind. Come inside, you can tell me they're fine while I'm looking at them. Clara looked at Silas. He shrugged, just slightly. She won't quit, he said. It's easier to let her. Rosa made a sound that managed to be both offended and pleased and shepherded Clara through the cookhouse door. Silas followed, stopping in the doorway to unlace his boots. Inside it was warm and full of the smell of things cooking, something with peppers and beef, something with cornmeal, coffee that had been on since morning and was now past its best but still available. A lamp burned on the big table. Braids of dried chilies hung from the ceiling beams. A girl appeared in the interior doorway, maybe Clara's age, maybe a year younger, with her grandmother's dark eyes and a completely unguarded face that showed exactly what she was thinking, which was, "Who is that?" "Mia," Rosa said, not turning around. "Bring me the first aid box and then go wash up for dinner." "Whose first aid box?" Mia disappeared and came back in under 30 seconds with a wooden box that she set on the table near Rosa before planting herself in a chair and watching Clara with open curiosity and no apparent self-consciousness about staring. Clara noticed her staring. Clara stared back briefly. "I'm Mia," the girl said. "Clara, what happened to you?" "Mia," Rosa said. "I'm just asking." "Ask less." Mia subsided, but only technically. She was still watching Clara with the same unfiltered interest, just doing it more quietly. Rosa had Clara sit, and she got the shoes off. Clara's face did a complicated thing when they came off, a tightening and then a careful return to neutral. And she looked at what was underneath, which was bad. Blisters burst and still oozing, 2 toes on the right foot that had gotten worse than the others. She cleaned and dressed the wounds with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of thing many times. And she did it without comment on the injuries themselves, and without asking questions Clara clearly wasn't going to answer. And Clara sat very still through the whole thing and watched Rosa's hands with an expression that, if Silas had been watching more closely, he might have described as something like grief. Not pain grief, but the expression of someone who couldn't quite believe they were being handled carefully, and didn't know how to exist inside that. Silas had stepped back to the doorway. He was watching the room from there. The lamplight, the 2 girls regarding each other sideways, Rosa working with her gray head bent. He had a memory that arrived without invitation, the way they always did. A small kitchen, a lamp, a child getting her knee bandaged after a fall, not crying, but making that specific sound, that catch in the throat, that she always made when she was trying not to cry. He hadn't handled it well. He'd been impatient. He was always impatient, always had somewhere to be. And he'd hurried the bandaging and gotten up too fast and missed the moment. He thought about that a lot, that missed moment. He thought about other ones too. He looked at Clara Whitmore sitting at Rosa's table, sunburned and half hollowed out and still holding herself like something that expected to get hit, and he thought, whoever left her out there had better hope I don't find them before the law does. He went and sat down at the table. "You hungry?" he asked. Clara looked up at him, that careful look again. "Yes," she said, like it was a confession. "Good," he said. "Rosa makes enough to feed a small army. It's actually a problem." "It is not a problem," Rosa said, without looking up from the bandaging. "It is abundance. They are different things. Mia snorted. Clara didn't laugh exactly, but something moved in her face. A small, involuntary twitch at the corner of her mouth that she shut down almost immediately, like she'd caught herself doing something she wasn't sure was allowed. Silas saw it. He looked down at the table and said nothing. Dinner was served in 3 stages. The beef and pepper stew, a pan of cornbread that had gone slightly over on one side, in the way that Rosa's cornbread always slightly went over on one side, and always somehow tasted better for it, and coffee with too much sugar that Mia put in hers when she thought Rosa wasn't paying attention. Clara ate carefully at first, controlled, small bites, and then her body apparently made a different decision, and she ate with the focused efficiency of someone doing something necessary. She finished what was on her plate. She looked at the pot on the stove. "More," Rosa said immediately, and didn't frame it as a question. "I shouldn't—" "More," Rosa said again, and served her. Clara ate it. Mia had decided, somewhere in the first 10 minutes, that Clara was interesting and possibly a good find, and was asking questions in the rapid-fire way of someone who's been raised around adults and has developed excellent instincts for what she could get away with. "Are you from Arizona?" "No." "Where from?" "New Mexico originally." "How old are you?" 13. "I'm 12. Do you know how to ride?" "Some." "Can you shoot?" Clara looked up at her. "No." "I can. Rosa doesn't know that." A pause. "She probably does." "She definitely does," Rosa said from the stove. Mia grinned. It was a grin of someone who was accustomed to being caught and found it mildly entertaining rather than troubling. Clara watched the exchange between them, the grandmother's exasperated warmth, the girl's cheerful immunity to consequences, with the look of someone watching something through a window that they have never been inside. Silas set his coffee cup down. "You don't have to answer anyone's questions you don't want to," he said. He said it to Clara, but generally, and Mia understood and rolled her eyes and subsided into her cornbread. Clara looked at him. "I know," she said. She didn't sound convinced of it. They gave her a room on the 2nd floor. A spare room, plain, with a wooden bed and a quilt and a window that looked out south over the pasture. Rosa put a basin of water and a cloth on the dresser and left a candle burning on the windowsill. "The door has a latch," Rosa said, "from the inside." Clara stood in the middle of the room and didn't say anything. "You sleep," Rosa said. In the morning, things looked different. She went out and pulled the door almost closed and didn't quite close it, leaving a thin sliver of lamplight from the hallway. Clara stood in the room for a long time. She went to the door and pushed it fully closed. She stood with her hand on it. Then she found the latch, a simple iron hook on a ring, and she looked at it. She latched it. Then she went and sat on the edge of the bed, in the dark, and the sounds of the house settled around her. The distant low conversation from downstairs, the creak of wood cooling in the night air, something that might have been an animal in the stable, a horse shifting. She didn't sleep for a long time. She thought about Evelyn, already somewhere else, already counting whatever she'd taken. She thought about her father's voice, the particular way he said Clara Bird, and how she was forgetting the exact sound of it more each month, the way you forget things whether you want to or not. She thought about Rosa's hands cleaning her feet without flinching. She thought about Mia's grin, that easy, uncalculating grin. She thought about the way Silas had held out his hand and waited without rushing her. "Why would you do that?" "You don't know me." She hadn't gotten a real answer. She'd noticed that. She'd also noticed he hadn't pretended it was nothing, hadn't waved it off with something easy and dishonest. He'd just looked at the horizon for a moment, and then he'd held out his hand. She thought about that for a long time in the dark, in the latched room. Outside, the desert cold had come in full, and the stars over the ranch were the wild, uncountable kind that you could only see when you were far enough from anywhere that the light didn't compete with them, and they were all out there beyond the glass, doing their silent, indifferent burning, the same as they'd been doing the whole time she'd been walking across the desert floor with the buzzards turning overhead and the heat pulling the water out of her and her father's voice the only thing standing between her and the ground. One step, then the next. She'd made it to the next step. She wasn't going to think past that tonight. She lay down on top of the quilt, still in her dress, and closed her eyes. And the sounds of the house continued around her, and eventually, without quite deciding to, she slept. She didn't know yet what she'd walked into the middle of. She didn't know that the ranch held its own grieving, its own closed rooms, its own collection of absences shaped like people who weren't there anymore. She didn't know that the man who'd pulled her out of the desert had his own reasons for riding south that afternoon, reasons he didn't examine too closely himself. She didn't know about the oil. She didn't know that Evelyn Graves wasn't finished with her yet. She knew one thing, going to sleep in a latched room with stars outside the window. She was alive, and she was off the desert floor, and for the moment, just for the moment, no one had her. For a girl who'd spent 3 years in someone else's hands, that was enough. Clara slept 11 hours. She knew because the sun was already high and past its morning angle when she finally came awake. And for one disoriented second, she had no idea where she was. The ceiling was wrong. The sounds were wrong. The smell was wood and dried peppers instead of the damp wool and kerosene of Evelyn's house. Then it came back. Not all at once, but in pieces. The wagon, and the road, and the desert, and the horse, and the man who hadn't asked too many questions. And she lay still for a moment with all of it settling back into place. The latch was still hooked. She'd checked it twice in the night, waking from shallow dreams to reach out in the dark and confirm it, fingers finding the iron hook in its ring. Still there. Still closed. She got up slowly. Her feet, bandaged and clean, were stiff and sore, but she could stand on them, which was better than she'd expected. She went to the basin Rosa had left and washed her face and hands and looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser. The sunburn had gone from red to a deeper, angrier shade overnight. Her lower lip had a split in it that had crusted over. Her hair was a complete ruin. She did what she could with it, which was not much, and went downstairs. The kitchen was empty except for Mia, who was sitting at the big table with a book open in front of her that she was clearly not reading, because the moment Clara appeared in the doorway, Mia's head came up and she closed the book with the specific energy of someone who has been waiting. "Rosa left you breakfast," Mia said. "It's keeping warm on the back of the stove. She had to go see about the laundry." "Where's Mr. Boone?" "Out since before dawn." "He's usually out since before dawn." Mia paused. "The cornmeal's in the blue pot. There's coffee if you want it, but it's been on since morning, so it's pretty bad." Clara went to the stove and found the blue pot and helped herself, and stood at the stove eating because it hadn't occurred to her to sit down. And Mia watched her with that unfiltered attention and apparently decided the watching was enough for now, which Clara appreciated. The cornmeal was plain and dense and very good. Clara ate all of it. "Do you want to see the horses after?" Mia said, when Clara set the pot back. Clara looked at her. "Why?" Mia shrugged. "Because they're there. Because it's something to do." A pause. "Because you look like you need something to do." It was a perceptive thing to say for a 12-year-old. Clara considered it. "All right," she said. The stables were behind the main house, a long, low building that smelled predictably of horses and hay and old leather and manure. All of it mixed together into something that wasn't unpleasant if you'd grown up around it. Mia moved through it with the familiarity of someone who'd spent significant portions of her life here, stopping at each stall to name the horse and give a brief summary of its personality, which she delivered with the authority of a small expert. "This one's Duchess. She'll bite you if you come in on the left side, don't ask me why. That one's called Pepper, but his real name on the papers is something in Spanish that nobody can say. Silas's horse is the gray one at the end. His name is Frank, which is a terrible name for a horse, but Silas named him and Silas doesn't care what you think about it." Clara was standing at the stall of a brown mare with a white blaze, holding out her hand flat while the horse considered it. "What's this one?" "Dell. She's the gentlest one. She's who they'd put you on if you wanted to ride." Mia leaned on the stall door. "Do you want to ride?" "Not today." "Your feet." "My feet," Clara agreed. Dell pushed her nose against Clara's palm, warm and heavy, and Clara stood still and let her. They stayed in the stables for a while. Mia talked. She was a talker, efficiently and without apparent need for reciprocation, which suited Clara fine. She talked about the ranch, about the hands and their various qualities and failings, about Rosa's cooking and which dishes were worth fighting for, and which ones Rosa made out of obligation and nobody really liked. She talked about the nearest town, Ridgecross, and the school there that she attended 3 days a week, and found largely pointless, but attended because Rosa required it. Clara listened and asked the occasional question, and Mia answered, and the morning moved past. It was in the afternoon that Silas came back, riding in with two of his hands, dusty and quieter than he'd been the night before. He unsaddled Frank himself. Clara had noticed that already, that he did that himself instead of handing it off, and came to find her where she was sitting on the porch with Rosa, who had returned from the laundry situation and was mending something. He sat down on the step and pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands. "How are the feet?" he said. "Better." "Good." He looked out at the yard. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight because it matters." Clara set down the piece of rope Mia had been teaching her a knot with. "All right." "That wagon you came off, you said something happened to it." He said it without inflection, just laid it out there. "That's not what happened, is it?" It wasn't a question. Clara looked at the yard too, at the dust and the fence line and the late afternoon shadow of the house stretching east. "No," she said, "that's not what happened." "Someone put you out there?" "Yes." "Who?" A pause. She'd been turning this over since she woke up, how much to say, whether to say it. She'd learned in Evelyn's house that talking about things had costs, that information was currency, and you didn't hand it over for free. But she was sitting on a man's porch. She'd eaten his food and slept in his house, and she was wearing a clean dress that Rosa had produced from somewhere without explanation. And the brown mare in the stable had pushed her nose into her palm that morning. And there was a 12-year-old girl somewhere in the house who'd spent her morning teaching a stranger knots because she'd decided to. "My stepmother," Clara said. "Her name's Evelyn Graves." Silas was quiet. Beside him, Rosa's mending had gone still, though her head stayed bent. "Your father?" Silas said. "Dead 2 years." Another silence. "You got any family? Anybody else?" "No." Silas turned his hat twice more in his hands. There was a particular quality to his silences, not uncomfortable, not pressing, just spacious, like he was giving things room to sit before he decided what to do with them. "She do this kind of thing before?" he said. Clara thought about the answer. "Not this," she said. "Other things." He nodded once. He seemed to understand the distinction. "There anything you want to tell me about why she'd do it? About what she was after?" And here Clara stopped. Because this was the thing she didn't fully understand yet herself, the shape she could sense but not see. Her father had told her, in those last fever days, that he'd taken care of her, that there was land, that she needed to find a man named Garrett in the county seat and give him a letter that he'd put in her coat pocket himself, pressing her hand around it, making her repeat the name back to him 3 times. "Garrett." "Say it again." "Garrett." She'd lost the letter. Evelyn had gone through her things the week after the funeral, and the letter had been there and then it had been gone, and Clara had understood without being told that asking about it was a bad idea. "My father left me something," she said slowly. "I don't know exactly what. Land, maybe. He told me there was land." Silas was very still. "He told me to find someone called Garrett in the county seat." "Garrett Foss?" Silas said. Clara looked at him. "I don't know. Just Garrett. Garrett Foss is the land recorder for Colfax County. He handles deeds, titles, transfers." Silas's voice had gone to something flat and thinking. "If your father registered land in your name, then Evelyn couldn't touch it," Clara said. She heard herself saying it and felt the pieces click together with a kind of cold, sick clarity. "She couldn't sell it or take it. Not unless you weren't around to contest it," Silas said. The porch was very quiet. Rosa set her mending down completely. She looked at Silas, and something passed between them, some communication that had no words in it, the kind that happens between people who've known each other long enough. "I need to ride to Ridgecross tomorrow," Silas said. "I need to talk to some people." He looked at Clara. "You stay here. Don't go anywhere. Don't talk to anyone who comes to the gate about where you are or who you are. Can you do that?" "Yes," Clara said. "Rosa will take care of you." "I know," Clara said, and meant it, and was surprised that she meant it. Silas nodded and got up and went inside, and the screen door swung shut behind him, and Clara sat on the porch in the long gold light of the late afternoon and looked at the desert in the distance and thought about her father pressing a letter into her hand and making her say a name 3 times, and wondered how much ahead of Evelyn he'd actually been, and whether it was enough. He'd tried to protect her. He'd done what he could while he was dying. That was the thing she had to hold on to. She held on to it. Silas rode out before sunup the next morning and came back 2 days later with a face that had the particular set of someone who'd learned things they hadn't wanted to know and had organized themselves around it anyway. He came into the kitchen where Clara and Mia were doing the dinner dishes. Clara had started doing the dishes on the second day without being asked, because she needed something to do with her hands, and because in Evelyn's house standing still had always been dangerous. And he sat down at the table, and Clara turned from the basin to look at him. "Your father registered the land 8 months before he died," Silas said. 40 acres in Colfax County, New Mexico, deeded directly to you, Clara Elaine Whitmore. He put a piece of paper on the table. "Garrett Foss kept a copy. He'd been waiting to hear from you, said your father told him a girl would come eventually." Clara dried her hands on the dishcloth. She came to the table and looked at the paper without touching it. "What kind of land?" she asked. Silas looked at her steadily. "The kind that has oil under it." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of water dripping from the edge of the basin. "How much?" Clara said. "Enough that 3 separate businessmen out of Santa Fe have been trying to buy it for the last 18 months. Every time Garrett told them it wasn't for sale, that the owner was a minor and no sale could be authorized without her consent." He paused. "Evelyn filed a claim 6 weeks ago, saying you died in a fever. Garrett didn't believe it. He was already writing letters to verify it when I showed up." Clara sat down. She did it slowly, like her legs had made a unilateral decision. "She filed a death certificate," she said. "Forged. It'll fall apart when anyone looks at it directly. But it would have bought her time to push the sale through before anyone noticed." He folded his hands on the table. "She had buyers lined up. The deal was supposed to close in 2 weeks. Clara stared at the paper with her name on it. Clara Elaine Whitmore. Her father's handwriting on the deed, the same handwriting she'd watched sign her birthday cards and ranch ledgers and Sunday letters, familiar as her own face. He'd known. He'd known Evelyn well enough to go behind her back, to move the most important thing out of reach, to give a dying man's best attempt at a shield to the daughter he was leaving behind. She pressed her thumb against the corner of the paper. She didn't pick it up. She just felt the edge of it. "What happens now?" she said. "Now I go to Texas," Silas said. "I've got a man in my crew who knows fraud law, and I know the county sheriff in Colfax, and together we're going to start collecting everything that ties Evelyn Graves to a forged death certificate and attempted property theft." He said it plainly with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a fence repair. "It'll take a few weeks, maybe longer." "You don't have to do this," Clara said. Silas looked at her. "I know. It's not your problem. It's not your land. She didn't—" Clara stopped. She was trying to say something honest, and it was getting tangled. "You've already done more than you needed to." "That may be," Silas said. He picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. "Doesn't change anything." Clara looked at him. "Why?" she said. Same question as before. The one he hadn't answered on the desert floor. He was quiet for a moment. He turned the empty cup in his hands. "I had a daughter," he said. He said it to the table, not to her. "Her name was June. She died 4 years ago. Fever, same as your father." He set the cup down. "She was 9. Clara didn't say anything. "There's a room upstairs I haven't opened since then." He shrugged, a minimal movement. "That's all. That's all I've got for you." It wasn't a tidy explanation. It didn't quite connect the pieces into something clean. But it was true. She could hear that it was true. The specific flatness of words that someone has carried a long time and doesn't dress up anymore because dressing them up costs too much. She didn't say "I'm sorry." It seemed too small for the weight of it, and she thought he'd probably heard it 1,000 times from people who meant it, and it hadn't helped. She said, "Her name was June." "Yes, that's a good name." Silas looked at her then. Something moved in his face and was gone. "Yeah," he said, "it is." He left for Texas 3 days later, early, with 2 armed hands and a leather satchel of documents that Garrett Foss had sent by messenger. He said goodbye to Rosa in the kitchen and to Mia, who was still half asleep and complaining about the hour, and he came to the door of the porch where Clara was standing in the cold early morning watching the stars go out one by one as the sky lightened. "You'll be all right here," he said. It was statement and question at once. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He seemed like he wanted to say something else and then thought better of it and turned for his horse. "Mr. Boone," she said. He stopped. She wanted to say something useful, something that acknowledged what she couldn't put words to, the fact of the deed with her name on it, the fact of the room he hadn't opened, the fact that he was riding toward a fight that wasn't his to ride toward. She didn't have the words for it. She was 13, and she'd spent 3 years being told she was worth nothing, and the vocabulary for the opposite of that was still mostly foreign to her. "Be careful," she said. It was inadequate. She knew it was inadequate. Silas looked back at her over his shoulder. The sky behind the eastern hills was going from black to deep blue, and the first pale, cold light was touching the tops of the fence posts. "Always am," he said, which was probably not true, but he said it in a way that was meant to be steady, and it was. And she watched him ride out through the gate until the dust took him. Behind her, through the screen door, she could hear Rosa moving in the kitchen, the sound of a pot being lifted, the low song Rosa always hummed before she had coffee and stopped humming after. The familiar shape of a morning starting without her having to arrange it or fear it. Just a morning, doing what mornings do. She stood on the porch a little longer. The stars were almost all gone now. The sky was getting on toward gray, and somewhere in the near pasture one of the horses made a long, quiet sound in the dark, and the desert was out there beyond the fence line, enormous and indifferent, the same desert that had tried to keep her 3 days ago. She was still here. She turned and went inside. 3 weeks passed at Boone Hollow Ridge, and Clara learned the shape of the days. She learned that Rosa was up before anyone else, that the cookhouse had light in it by 4:30 every morning and coffee by 5, and that arriving early enough to help with breakfast was the closest thing to a password for entering Rosa's good graces, which Clara had figured out on her 3rd day and acted on accordingly. She learned that Mia was genuinely impossible to wake before 7 unless you mentioned horses, and that the ranch hands ate in 2 shifts and left their plates in a specific order that Rosa had established years ago and would correct you about if you got wrong. She learned that the eastern pasture had a fence post that made a sound in the wind that carried all the way to the house on still nights, a low, intermittent groan that had scared her badly the first time she heard it before Mia explained it. She learned small things about herself, too, things she hadn't had the quiet to notice before. That she slept better when she latched the door, but that she'd started leaving the window open because the night air helped. That she was good with the horses, genuinely good, not just not afraid. And that Dell had decided to trust her specifically, which Mia said didn't happen with everyone. That she could get through most of a day without flinching at sudden sounds, as long as the sounds were ranch sounds, as long as they made sense in context. She was healing. Not all the way, and not smoothly, but in the stubborn, incremental way that things heal when the damage is real and the conditions are just decent enough to allow it. It was Mia who told her, 17 days after Silas rode out, that a newspaper from Ridgecross had come in with the mail. Rosa had apparently tried to intercept it, but Mia had faster hands and a pre-established curiosity about things Rosa tried to intercept, and she came to find Clara in the stable with the paper folded under her arm and an expression that was half excitement and half the look of someone who knows they're about to hand over something that's going to hurt. "You might want to read this outside," Mia said. "Give it to me." Mia gave it to her. The headline was on the lower half of the front page, below a story about a water rights dispute and next to an advertisement for a dry goods store. It said, "Ridgecross Cattle Baron harbors runaway girl. Family. Searching for missing child." Clara read it standing in the stable doorway with Dell warm behind her and the morning light coming flat and bright off the yard. She read it twice. Her hands didn't shake. She was proud of that later, but in the moment she didn't notice it. The story was 3 paragraphs. It described, in the careful language of someone who had been told exactly what to say, a grieving stepmother searching for her missing stepdaughter who had run away following the death of her father. It described Silas Boone as a solitary cattle rancher who had reportedly taken in the child without notification of authorities. It mentioned that the stepmother, identified as Mrs. Evelyn Graves, had filed a missing persons report and was offering a reward. It quoted a lawyer named Aldrich, who described the situation as a clear case of a vulnerable child being kept from her rightful guardian. Rightful guardian. Clara folded the paper. She looked at the yard for a moment. "She knows where I am," she said. "The paper doesn't say you're here," Mia said. "It just says She knows. Clara held the paper loosely at her side. She filed the missing persons report in Ridgecross. She's been watching for where I'd show up. Ridgecross is the closest town. She thought about it, running it forward the way she'd learned to in Evelyn's house, always trying to stay one step ahead of what was coming. She knows I'm here. She's just not ready yet. She's building something first. Mia was quiet for a moment. You should tell Rosa. Rosa's reaction to the newspaper when Clara brought it to her was controlled in the specific way of someone who had already been worrying about exactly this. She read it, folded it, and put it in the pocket of her apron. Silas needs to know, she said. How do we reach him? I can get a message to the sheriff in Colfax County. He'll know how to find him. She was already untying her apron. You go nowhere near the front gate. You understand me? Nobody who comes to that gate, I don't care who they say they are, you don't talk to them. I know, Clara said. Mr. Boone already told me. I'm telling you again. Rosa looked at her directly. Evelyn Graves did not put a newspaper story out because she's giving up. She put it out because she's starting something. And when a woman like that starts something, you need to be ready. The message went out that afternoon with one of the hands riding hard toward Colfax County. Silas's reply came back 4 days later, terse and written in the compressed way of a man who had things to say that he didn't want on paper. Found what we came for, coming back within the week. Don't let her near the girl. 2 days after that, the visitors arrived. There were 3 of them, and they came in a good carriage with a hired driver, which told you something about what they thought of themselves. 2 men in suits and a woman in black traveling clothes, and the woman was Evelyn Graves. And Clara knew she was there before she saw her because she recognized the sound of that particular knock. 3 times, precisely spaced, the knock of someone who expected to be answered immediately. Clara was upstairs when she heard it. She went to the window and looked down at the front gate and saw the carriage and felt the cold go through her, the specific cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Rosa answered the door. Clara could hear the exchange from the top of the stairs. Rosa's voice level and unmoved, the lawyer Aldrich's voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone used to persuading people who didn't want to be persuaded. Ma'am, we have a legal document here establishing Mrs. Graves as the guardian of the minor child and requesting— Mr. Boone isn't here, Rosa said. Nothing on this property gets decided without Mr. Boone. Ma'am, the document supersedes— Come back when Mr. Boone is here. A pause. Then Evelyn's voice, and hearing it after almost 4 weeks, sent Clara's hand to the stair rail without her meaning to put it there. That voice. That particular flat tone, just warm enough on the surface to sound reasonable, just controlled enough underneath to carry the threat without stating it. I only want to see my daughter, Evelyn said. Surely you can't object to that. She's not your daughter, Rosa said. The courts would disagree with you. The courts aren't here. Mr. Boone will be back in 2 days. If you want to wait in Ridgecross, wait in Ridgecross. There was a long silence. Clara, standing at the top of the stairs with her hand on the rail, heard Evelyn make a sound, small and controlled, that she recognized as the sound Evelyn made when she was storing something away for later use, not angry, calculating. Tell the child her mother is looking for her, Evelyn said. The door closed. Rosa stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at Clara without surprise. She'd known Clara was there. She'll be back, Claire said. Yes, Rosa said, she will. Silas rode in the following evening, ahead of schedule, with his 2 hands and a third man Clara hadn't seen before, a lean man with a leather case, who turned out to be a lawyer named Devereaux from Santa Fe, who shook Clara's hand like she was an adult and looked at her with the careful attention of someone assembling a case in his head. Silas listened to Rosa's account of the visit without interrupting. His face did nothing visible during it, but Clara had been watching him long enough to know the difference between his actual calm and the arranged version of it, and this was the arranged version. All right, he said when Rosa finished. Here's what we've got. He spread papers on the kitchen table. A lot of papers, more than Clara had expected. Forged death certificate registered 6 weeks ago in Colfax County. 3 signed depositions from the businessmen she approached about the land sale, 2 of whom are willing to testify that she told them the owner was dead and the property was available. Garrett Foss has a sworn statement about the deed registration and the date. He looked at the table. And we have one more thing. He looked at Devereaux, who reached into his leather case and produced a letter. He set it on the table in front of Clara. She knew before she touched it. The handwriting on the outside, for Clara, to be opened when needed, was her father's. Her throat tightened. Garrett Foss had it, Silas said quietly. Your father left it with the deed. Garrett said he was very specific. It was for you, not for anyone claiming to represent you. She picked up the letter. It was thin, 1 page, maybe 2. She held it and didn't open it. You don't have to read it now, Silas said. I know, she said. She put it in the pocket of her dress and left her hand over it. Devereaux laid out what was coming over the next hour, walking through it with the patient clarity of a man who understood that one of the people at his table was 13 years old and needed to understand what she was walking into. A formal hearing had been scheduled in Ridgecross. Evelyn's lawyers had pushed it through fast, leveraging the missing persons report and the guardianship paperwork she'd filed. Devereaux was going to contest both. The forged death certificate was the linchpin. If it collapsed, the guardianship claim collapsed with it, because Evelyn had built her legal position on Clara being either dead or legally in her custody, and the death certificate was what she'd used to get that process started. She's good, Devereaux said without admiration. She's had help. Aldrich is not a cheap lawyer, and he doesn't work for cheap clients. How'd she pay him? Silas said. My guess? Promise of a cut of the land sale. He shrugged. Wouldn't be the first time. What do you need from Clara? Rosa said. Devereaux looked at Clara. I need to know if you're willing to testify. I can build most of this without you. The documents are strong, but a judge hearing it from her directly, in her own words, carries weight that paper doesn't. He paused. I want to be clear. It means sitting in a room with her and answering questions in front of people and not flinching. It'll be uncomfortable. Clara thought about the road, the wagon getting smaller in the heat haze, the buzzards. I can do that, she said. You sure? I'm sure. Devereaux nodded. He seemed to believe her. The hearing was set for 10 days out, which was enough time for word to get around Ridgecross, and not enough time for much else. Word did get around. Clara knew it had when the second newspaper story appeared, this one longer and nastier than the first, with a description of Silas Boone that Clara read with a cold fury she hadn't expected in herself. It called him a troubled widower who had inserted himself into a family matter, and it implied, without quite stating, that his motives for keeping Clara at the ranch were something darker than rescue. She brought the paper to Silas. He read it. His jaw moved once. Throw it out, he said. People will believe it, she said. Some people, he said, not the ones that matter. How do you know which ones matter? He looked at her. The ones in that courtroom with us, he said. She threw the paper out. The night before the hearing, she read her father's letter. She read it alone in her room with the window open and the desert night coming in cold and clean around the lamp. She'd been carrying it in her pocket for 8 days without opening it, not quite ready, not sure what she was waiting for. The letter was 2 pages. His handwriting was shakier than she remembered from before the fever, and that detail cost her something. But the voice was his, plain-spoken, careful, slightly awkward in the way he always was when he tried to write down things he found easier to say. He told her about the land. He told her what he'd done to protect it, and why. He told her he was sorry he'd brought Evelyn into their lives, that he'd made a mistake, and he'd known it too late. And the way he wrote it, without excuses, without asking Clara to absolve him, she recognized as the same way he'd always acknowledged when he'd gotten something wrong, directly and then past it. He told her she was the best thing that had happened to him. He said it plainly, without dressing it up, and she had to put the letter down for a moment. He said, I don't know who'll find you this, or when, or what shape you'll be in when they do, but you're still here, which means you did the hard part. You always were better at the hard parts than you thought you were, Clara Bird. Now do the next one. She folded the letter and held it. She didn't cry. She'd thought she would, but she didn't. She just sat with it for a while, with his words in her hands and the desert outside the window, and let it settle into whatever place it was going to settle. Then she went to bed. The courthouse in Ridgecross was a 2-story sandstone building on the main street, not large, with a gallery of wooden benches that could hold about 60 people and was holding more than that on the morning of the hearing. Clara came in with Silas on one side and Devereaux on the other, and Rosa directly behind her, and she kept her eyes forward and her hands still, and she did not look for Evelyn until she was seated at the table with Devereaux's papers spread in front of her. Then she looked, Evelyn was at the opposite table with Aldrich and one other man Clara didn't recognize. She was dressed carefully, dark blue, respectable, composed in the way she always was in public. She looked to anyone who didn't know her like a worried mother. She'd always been good at that. The composed grief, the restrained concern, all the performed emotions that rid well to strangers. She met Clara's eyes across the room and held them for a moment, and something passed across her face. Not guilt, nothing so clean as that. More like calculation, reassessment. The look of someone who had thought they'd accounted for all the variables and was now reconsidering one of them. Clara held her gaze and did not look away first. The judge was a heavy-set man named Calloway, who had the look of someone who'd been doing this long enough to have seen most of it before, and had organized his patience accordingly. He opened the hearing without ceremony, reviewed the documentation from both sides, and asked Aldrich to present first. Aldrich was good at his job. Clara watched him work the room. The measured outrage, the careful sympathetic framing, the way he referred to Evelyn as this grieving mother, and to Silas as this man, with just enough emphasis to let the audience do the rest of the work. He introduced the guardianship paperwork and the missing persons report, and a character statement from a neighbor back in New Mexico who had apparently known Evelyn for years and found her wonderful. Then Devereaux presented his case, and it was different in the way that the truth, when it's organized well, is different from a performance. He walked through the death certificate, its registration date, the name of the registrar, the testimony of the county clerk who confirmed it had been filed under questionable circumstances. He presented the deed. He presented Garrett Foss's deposition. He presented the statements from the Santa Fe businessmen. He presented the letter. Aldrich objected to the letter on 3 different grounds, each of which Judge Calloway considered and overruled. The letter was entered as evidence and read aloud by Devereaux in a flat, careful voice, and Clara kept her eyes on the table in front of her during the reading and her hand pressed flat against the wood. Then Calloway looked at Clara. "Young lady," he said, "you've heard both sides here. I'd like to hear from you directly, if you're willing." She stood up. The room had the particular quality of held breath that a room gets when everyone in it is paying attention to the same thing at the same time. She could feel it. 60 people plus however many were standing at the back, and Evelyn Graves 12 feet away, and her father's letter just entered into the record. She looked at the judge. "She told me to get down from the wagon and wait," Clara said. "She told me she needed to check the back wheel. I got down and she drove away. She didn't come back." Calloway wrote something. "And you understood this to be intentional." "It was planned," Clara said. "She gave me something in my water the night before to make me sleep so I wouldn't know where we were. She put me off the wagon in the middle of the desert with no water and no way to get back to the road. It was planned. Quiet in the room." "Why would she do that?" Calloway said. "Because my father left me land. She knew about it, and she couldn't access it while I was alive to contest it, so she needed me not to be alive." Clara said it without heat, without drama, the way you say something you've had time to understand completely. "She filed the death certificate before she even left me out there. She'd already arranged the buyers. She just needed me gone." Calloway looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Graves, you have the opportunity to respond." Evelyn stood. She had her composure entirely. That was the thing about her. Even now, even with Devereaux's documents on the table and Clara standing 12 feet away, she had her composure. "Your Honor," she said, in that careful, modulated tone, "this child has been separated from family and manipulated by a man with his own interests at stake. What she's describing, she didn't lose me," Clara said. The room went still. She hadn't planned it. It came out before Devereaux could stop her, before Calloway could intervene, before anyone could do anything about it. She was looking at Evelyn when she said it. "She didn't lose me," she said again, clearer. "She threw me away." The room erupted. Calloway's gavel came down 3 times before the noise sorted itself back into order. And in that noise, Clara heard things. Outrage, surprise. A woman somewhere in the back making a sound that wasn't quite a word. She didn't look at the gallery. She kept her eyes on Evelyn. Evelyn's composure had cracked. Just at the edges, just barely. A tightness around the mouth, a flicker in the eyes. But it was there, visible. And Clara had the strange and unexpected feeling of seeing something true about a person that they'd spent years making sure nobody would see. She was afraid. Evelyn Graves was afraid, and Clara had just made her show it to a room full of people. Calloway restored order and continued the hearing, and Aldrich tried twice more to redirect and each time found less traction than before. And eventually the hearing concluded, and Calloway said he would have a ruling within the week and sent everyone out of the room. In the hallway outside, Devereaux was already talking to Silas in a low, rapid voice, and Rosa had her hand on Clara's shoulder, and the crowd from the gallery was moving past them in the way that crowds do when something has happened that they'll be talking about for a while. Clara stood in the middle of all of it and breathed. Her hands were shaking now. They hadn't shaken in the courtroom. They waited until after, which she supposed was decent of them. "You weren't supposed to say that," Devereaux said, arriving in front of her with his leather case under his arm. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man revising his assessment of a situation. "I know," Clara said. "It was probably the best thing anyone said today." She looked at him. "The part where she flinched," he said quietly. "The whole room saw it." He paused. "Judges notice what rooms see." Silas said nothing. He was standing slightly apart from the others, and when Clara looked at him, he was already looking at her, and whatever was on his face was something she didn't have a name for yet. Not pride exactly, something bigger and less organized than pride. She looked away because it was too much to hold for long. Outside, the sun on the Ridgecross Main Street was hard and flat, and the cottonwoods along the road were losing the last of their leaves, and somewhere down the block, Evelyn Graves was getting into her carriage with her lawyer and her ruined composure. And Clara Whitmore stood on the courthouse steps, with the people who'd shown up for her and watched the dust settle where the carriage had been. She was still shaking. She put her hands in her pockets. She felt the folded edge of her father's letter against her fingers. "You always were better at the hard parts than you thought you were, Clara Bird." She stood there until her hands stopped. Judge Calloway's ruling came in 5 days. Devereaux rode out to the ranch personally to deliver it, which told Clara something before he'd even opened his mouth. Because lawyers who sent bad news tended to send it on paper. He came in and sat at the kitchen table and accepted Rosa's coffee and opened his leather case with the particular unhurried quality of a man who knew he had something worth taking his time with. "Guardianship claim dismissed," he said. "Death certificate voided and referred to the county prosecutor as a fraudulent filing. The deed stands in Clara's name, uncontested." He set the ruling on the table. And Calloway referred the full matter, the forgery, the abandonment, the attempted land fraud, to the territorial court for criminal charges. Rosa crossed herself. Mia made a sound that was almost a word. Silas said nothing. He looked at the ruling for a moment, then looked at Clara. Clara looked at the paper. Her name was on it again. Clara Elaine Whitmore, sole legal owner. And below that a paragraph about the voided death certificate written in the dry, careful language of legal documents. And at the bottom, Calloway's signature. "What happens to Evelyn?" she said. Devereaux wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "The territorial court will issue charges. Forgery of a public document, child endangerment, attempted fraud, possibly more, depending on what the prosecutor decides to pursue." He paused. "Her lawyers will try to negotiate. Some of it may stick, some may not. That's how it goes." "Will she go to prison?" He was quiet for a moment, honest enough not to give her a guarantee. "The forgery charge alone carries significant time. The abandonment, putting a child in a desert with no water, that's harder to walk away from. I'd say her options are narrow." He looked at her steadily. "But I want you to prepare yourself for the possibility that the law does its thing, and it doesn't feel like enough. It sometimes doesn't." Clara nodded. She'd thought about this already, in the nights since the hearing, turning it over in the dark. She still wanted, something that felt proportionate, something that matched the weight of what had been done. She understood, at 13, that the law didn't usually work in proportions. It worked in charges and sentences and negotiations, and justice was something you assembled out of those pieces as best you could, and then lived with what was left over. "All right," she said. Devereaux left after lunch, and the ranch went about its afternoon, and Clara took Dell out to the eastern pasture fence and back, which was something she'd started doing when she needed to think. Dell didn't require much from her, just the weight of direction, a loose rein, and a sense of where they were going. And the movement helped in the same way her father's one step, then the next had helped. It kept the forward motion happening when her head wanted to stop and circle. She thought about the charges. She thought about Evelyn in a courtroom, finally in the position Clara had been in. She tried to feel satisfied about it and found the satisfaction incomplete, not absent but limited, like a meal that was enough but not what you'd been hungry for. What she'd been hungry for was harder to name. She thought it might be something like acknowledgement, not just a legal ruling, but some larger admission that it had happened, that it had been real, that a woman had looked at a 13-year-old child and calculated what she was worth and decided she was worth more dead. The law couldn't give her that. She already knew it. She turned Dell toward home and let the horse find her own pace. What changed at the ranch in the weeks after the ruling was subtle, and Clara almost didn't notice it happening because it happened around her rather than to her. The hands, who had been respectful but careful with her before, the way men are careful around a situation they don't fully understand, relaxed somewhat. Hector, who ran the morning crew and had a wide, quiet face and 3 children he talked about constantly, started including her in the practical conversation of the ranch without self-consciousness, asking her opinion on Dell's left foreleg, which had been bothering her slightly, explaining the fence repair rotation, treating her opinions as things worth having. A couple of the others followed his lead. The days developed a texture she hadn't had since before her father got sick. She helped Rosa with the kitchen work in the mornings, and went out with Mia in the afternoons, and sometimes sat with Silas in the evenings on the south porch while he went through his ledgers, neither of them talking much, which was its own kind of companionship. She started reading again. Rosa had books, more than Clara would have expected, a shelf in the back hallway full of everything from land law texts to 3-year-old newspapers to a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe that Clara worked through in a week and handed back without comment, and Rosa replaced with something else. Mia, for her part, had decided to make Clara's education in ranch skills her personal project, with a thoroughness that Clara found both useful and occasionally exhausting. "You need to know how to rope," Mia said one afternoon, approximately 3 minutes after Clara had mentioned she'd never learned. "I don't need to rope anything right now." "You don't know that. What if a calf gets loose?" "Then I'll get you." "What if I'm not here?" "Then I'll get someone else." Mia handed her the rope. "Just try it." Clara tried it. She was bad at it. Mia was diplomatically silent about how bad, and then she practiced it badly for 40 minutes until she was moderately less bad, and Mia said better in the tone of a teacher who is being generous. And Clara felt the specific small satisfaction of getting less bad at something she'd had no reason to know before. These were not dramatic moments. They were ordinary ones, which was precisely what made them significant, because ordinary was something Clara hadn't had in a long time. Ordinary meant that the day had a shape, and the shape was mostly predictable, and the predictability was safe. It meant you could be bad at roping without consequences. It meant that dinner was at the same time, and Rosa's cornbread always went slightly over on one side, and Mia always snuck too much sugar into her coffee, and Silas always came in from the range later than he said he would, and never apologized for it. And Rosa always pretended to be more irritated about this than she actually was. Clara moved inside all of it gradually, the way you move into cold water. Careful at first, then less careful, then not thinking about it anymore. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when Silas came in from the range and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Clara had learned to read as meaning he'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided to say it. Rosa looked up from the stove. Mia was doing her letters at the table. Clara was sitting across from her with a book she'd stopped reading about 10 minutes ago. "Clara," Silas said, "you mind coming out to the porch a minute?" She set the book down and went. The evening was cooling off. The sun was down behind the western hills, but the sky still held the last of the light, a deep layered blue going dark at the top. Silas sat on the step, and Clara sat on the bench, and they were quiet for a moment in the way they sometimes were, and she waited. "I've been thinking about something," he said, "and I want to say it plain, and I want you to know you can say no, and it doesn't change anything about this situation." She looked at him. "I'd like to talk to the court about making this permanent." He said it to the yard, not to her, turning his hat slowly. "About adoption, making you my daughter legally." He stopped. "If that's something you'd want." Clara was very still. The word adoption sat between them in the evening air, and she looked at it from the inside, turning it the way she'd turned the rope that afternoon, trying to feel its shape, understand its weight. "Why?" she said. Not suspiciously, just the real question, the way she'd asked it twice before. He was quiet for long enough that she knew he was going to actually answer it this time. "Because you've been here 3 months," he said. "And in those 3 months, I've watched you figure out how to trust a horse again and help Rosa before she asks, and not flinch when the gate bangs in the wind anymore." He stopped. He seemed to be finding his way through it without a map. "Because you eat Rosa's overcooked cornbread without saying anything, and you let Mia teach you things you don't need to know to make her feel useful, and you read out on the south porch in the evenings instead of going inside, and I don't think you know you started doing that." He looked at her then. "Because this is your home now, if you want it to be. And I'd like that to be more than just a fact. I'd like it to be a thing that's on paper and can't be taken back." Clara looked at the yard. She was doing the thing she did when something was too big to respond to immediately, going still and letting it settle. "The land," she said. "What about it?" "I have the land, 40 acres. It's mine legally." "Yes. I don't need someone to manage it for me. I don't need protection through a name." "No," he said. "You don't." He said it matter-of-factly without being bothered by the implication. "That's not why I'm asking." She looked at him. "I'm asking because June's been gone 4 years and I didn't do a good job with her when she was here. I was impatient and I worked too much and I missed things I should have caught. And I'm not saying you replace her because you don't. Nobody replaces anybody." He said it directly and without sentiment, which was the only way she'd have believed it. "But you're here, and I'd like you to stay, and I'd like to do better at it this time." Clara looked at her hands. She thought about the latched door. She thought about waking in this house that first morning and not knowing where she was. The ceiling wrong, the sounds wrong. She thought about it being less wrong each day, incremental and unannounced, until it had stopped being wrong at all. She thought about what it would mean to have a name that was a choice, chosen by someone who knew what she'd come from and what she'd cost and wanted her anyway, a name that nobody could take back. "I've wanted to call you Dad," she said, "since the day you stopped your horse." She said it quietly, not looking at him. It was the truest thing she'd said out loud in years, and saying it made her face go hot with the specific embarrassment of being entirely sincere in front of another person. Silas didn't say anything for a moment. When she looked over, he was looking at the yard too, and there was something on his face that she didn't look at directly. The same way you don't look directly at bright light, not because it's bad, but because it's more than your eyes can take all at once. "All right," he said. His voice was not entirely level. "All right," she said. They sat on the porch as the sky finished going dark and the stars came out, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was not uncomfortable. Inside, Rosa's pots made their familiar sounds, and somewhere Mia was arguing a point about something with the energy of someone who'd been saving up the argument all day. And the desert beyond the fence was doing what it always did. Enormous and present, and not particularly concerned with any of this. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and thought about her father's letter in her pocket, which she kept with her still, and thought that he would have liked this porch. He would have liked the space of the view and the way the evening came in out here, big and unhurried. He would probably have had opinions about the fence line. She thought he would have liked Silas, on balance. Not immediately. He'd have been careful about it, the same way Clara had been careful. But eventually. The adoption filing went in 2 weeks later, and Devereaux handled it with the same quiet efficiency he'd brought to everything else. The process required a formal hearing, a judge, documentation. It wasn't fast. Devereaux said probably 2 months, maybe more if anything came up. What came up in early November was the news about Evelyn, Silas told Clara himself, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter from Devereaux in front of him. Evelyn Graves had entered into a plea agreement with the territorial prosecutor. Forgery, first count, 18 months. Child endangerment, 2 years, to run concurrently. The attempted fraud charges had been reduced as part of the negotiation. She would serve time, Devereaux wrote, at the Territorial Women's Facility in Santa Fe. Clara read the letter. She set it down. "Is that enough?" Mia asked from across the table. It was a direct question, the kind Mia specialized in, and Clara didn't have a fast answer. "It's what it is," she said finally. "That's not the same as enough." "No," Clara said, "it's not." Silas folded the letter. He didn't offer an opinion on whether the sentence was adequate, which Clara appreciated because she didn't want anyone's opinion on it. It was a thing she needed to sit with herself, in her own time, and come to her own terms with. She thought about it for a few days. She thought about proportions again, about what justice looked like when it was rendered by institutions that operated in categories and minimums and negotiations. She thought about Evelyn in a facility in Santa Fe and tried to figure out what she felt about that, and what she found was complicated in the way that things are complicated when you've lived in proximity to someone who damaged you. Not simple hatred, not clean satisfaction, but something lumpy and unresolved that was probably going to take years to fully examine. What she found underneath it was that it mattered less to her than she'd thought it would. Not because it wasn't serious, because something else had moved into the center of her attention, gradually and without announcement. And Evelyn Graves was increasingly the periphery of a life that had more at its middle now. That realization surprised her a little. She sat with it. In the second week of November, the first real cold came to Boone Hollow Ridge, the kind that had teeth in it, and the morning routine shifted to account for it. Heavier wood in the stoves, extra blankets pulled down, the horses' water checked twice a day for ice. Clara had been at the ranch long enough by now to participate in the seasonal shift rather than observe it, and she did, without being asked. Mia had acquired a birthday somewhere in there. Clara had almost missed it, not yet knowing the date. And Rosa made a cake that was slightly lopsided on one side, and Hector produced a fiddle from somewhere and played 3 songs badly and 1 song well, and Clara sat at the dinner table in the warm, crowded cookhouse and watched Mia blow out the candles with the specific theatrical commitment of a girl who believed birthdays deserved full effort. "How old?" Hector asked. 13, Mia said. "Like Clara." "We're the same age now," Mia said with satisfaction, as though this closed something. Clara ate her lopsided cake and felt the warmth of the room on her face and thought, not for the first time, this is what it was supposed to be like. It was a thought that had 2 edges. The grief of knowing what she'd missed and the presence of what was here now, both at once, neither canceling the other. Later that night, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Mia had fallen asleep mid-sentence on the settee and been relocated to bed by Rosa, Claire was helping stack the dishes when she heard Silas's voice from the hallway. "Leave those," he said. "Come out to the porch." She set the dish down and followed him out. The cold hit immediately, sharp and clean, the kind that made the stars look closer than they were. The yard was silver with it, the fence posts casting moon shadows in the late light. Silas stood at the porch rail and looked out south. "What?" Clara said. "Nothing," he said. "Just wanted to stand out here a minute." She stood beside him. The night was very quiet. "The hearing's in 3 weeks," he said after a while. "I know. Devereaux says Calloway might handle it himself, since he knows the background. Is that good?" "Probably." She looked at the desert. The cold was coming off it in layers, all that stored heat finally given back to the sky. 3 weeks. 3 weeks and then a hearing, and then either yes or not yet. And either way she was here, which was the part she was trying to hold on to as the actual ground rather than what the court decided. She was here. She was not on the road and not in Evelyn's house and not in the desert with the buzzards. She was standing on a porch in the cold November night next to a man who'd stopped his horse and waited and hadn't asked for anything back. "Silas," she said. "Hmm? Can I—" She stopped, started again. "Is it all right if I call you?" "Yes," he said, before she'd finished the question. She looked at him. "Yes," he said again. Simpler, just that. She turned back to the desert. "Dad," she said, testing it. Or not testing it, just saying it the way you say something that's been waiting to be said. He didn't make a production of it. His hand came off the rail and landed on her shoulder briefly, just briefly, the same way he'd put his hand on her shoulder that first night in the desert when he'd needed her to look at him. Then he took it back, and they both looked at the desert and the cold stars and the long silver sweep of the land that was hers and his and the ranches and none of it and all of it at once. And the night did what nights do, which is hold whatever you put into them without comment. She was still cold. She didn't go inside. The 3 weeks passed the way the previous ones had. Not quickly, but with enough substance in them that they didn't feel like waiting so much as living. Clara had learned, somewhere in the months at Boone Hollow Ridge, to tell the difference. She was still learning other things. She was learning that Silas had a temper he kept on a short leash, and that when the leash slipped, when a hand did something careless with the stock, or when the fence on the North Range went down for the third time in 2 months, his voice went flat and quiet rather than loud, which was somehow worse. She was learning that he didn't always say what was bothering him when it was bothering him, that he processed things at his own speed, and then appeared in a doorway a day later and said what he'd been thinking in 2 sentences and considered the matter handled. She was learning that this was irritating and also that she did something similar, and that Rosa found it irritating in both of them and said so regularly. She was learning that Mia was fiercely loyal, but also 13, which meant she was occasionally cruel in the careless way that 13-year-olds are, saying something sharp without meaning it to land sharp, and then spending the subsequent hour being demonstratively kind to compensate. She was learning that she herself did the same thing sometimes, snapping at Mia over nothing, feeling the guilt of it before the echo had finished, not quite knowing how to apologize cleanly. These were not the big things. They were the small, persistent texture of people living in proximity, which was its own kind of education, the kind that doesn't come from books or hard circumstances, but from ordinary friction with ordinary people who you've decided to stay near. She'd spent 3 years in Evelyn's house learning to minimize that friction entirely, to make herself frictionless, to move through spaces without disturbing them. What she was learning now was that friction wasn't always damage. Sometimes it was just people in contact. The hearing was scheduled for the first Monday of December. The night before, Clara couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. She still had nights like this, fewer than before but present, lying in the dark with her hand near the latch, out of habit, while her mind ran the same material in loops. But tonight the loops had a specific subject. The question the lawyer had told her was coming. Devereaux had prepared her. He'd sat with her at the kitchen table 2 days ago and walked through the process, which was different from the guardianship hearing. Smaller, quieter, procedurally straightforward. No opposing counsel, no Evelyn, just the judge, the documentation, the petitioner, and the child. Calloway will ask you a question, Devereaux had said. Standard practice in adoption hearings. He wants to hear from you directly, in your own words, that this is what you want. It's not complicated. What kind of question? Usually something about your understanding of what adoption means, sometimes something more personal. Calloway's been on the bench 20 years. He's not trying to trick you. He just wants to know you're choosing this, not being moved into it. She'd nodded. She'd thought about it since, turning it over, trying to prepare an answer the way you prepare for a test. But every time she tried to formulate something complete and coherent, it came apart in her hands, because the true answer wasn't the kind that organized itself into clean sentences. It was too big, and too tangled, and too much hers. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch at night. The familiar sounds, the wind on the east pasture fence, that low intermittent groan she'd once found frightening, now as ordinary as breathing, a horse shifting in the stable, the creak of the house cooling in the cold. She thought about her father. She thought about the letter, which was in her coat pocket for tomorrow, where it had been since the day Devereaux gave it to her. She thought about June, whose room had been opened last month. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just opened, the way you open a window when you decide the air needs to come in. She'd seen Silas come out of it one morning with a small pair of boots in his hands, and he'd stood in the hallway for a moment, and then he'd put the boots on the shelf in the front room where they were visible, which Clara thought was a decision worth something. She thought about the porch and the cold night, and yes said before she'd finished asking. She thought, you don't choose your family the first time. You get handed what you get handed. But if you're careful and honest and lucky in the right ways, sometimes you get to choose it the second time. That was the closest she'd gotten to an answer. She held it in the dark and waited for morning. Ridgecross was cold in December, the kind of cold that had intention to it. The main street had a skin of frozen mud that made the horses careful, and the cottonwoods along the road were bare now, their branches thin against the white winter sky. The courthouse looked the same as it had in October, same sandstone, same 2 stories, but the light was different, low and flat, and the street quieter. They came in 3 vehicles, Silas and Clara in the front wagon, Rosa and Mia behind them in the second with Hector driving, and Devereaux meeting them on the courthouse steps already in his coat with his leather case and a look of someone who'd been up since early and was comfortable with that. You ready? He said to Clara. Yes, she said. Mia appeared at her elbow. You look fine, she said, which was Mia's version of reassurance and meant more than it sounded because Mia didn't give it out routinely. "I know," Clara said. "You're making a face like you're going to be sick." "I'm not going to be sick. You look like—" "Mia," Rosa said. Mia subsided. The courtroom was smaller with fewer people in it. No gallery crowd today, no reporters, no opposing counsel, and their carriage outside. Just the bailiff and a clerk and Devereaux and a woman from the Territorial Welfare Office who was there to confirm she'd reviewed the case and found no objection. The benches were mostly empty. Rosa and Mia and Hector sat in the front row, which in these circumstances felt like more than a front row. Calloway came in without the entrance his position technically warranted. Just a man in his 50s in a judge's robe who moved like someone whose knees had opinions about cold mornings. He sat and put on his glasses and looked at the papers in front of him for a moment. And then he looked at Clara, and the look was not unkind. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Sir, I've reviewed the petition and the associated documents. Everything's in order." He folded his hands. "I understand you've been at Boone Hollow Ridge for approximately 4 months." "Yes, sir." "And in that time you've been under the care of Mr. Boone and his household?" "Yes." He looked at Silas. "Mr. Boone, the record reflects your petition, your background review, and your financials, all of which are satisfactory. I have one question for you." A pause. "Adoption is permanent. Whatever comes, whatever she does, whatever happens, permanent. You understand that?" "Yes," Silas said. The same way he'd said it on the porch, flat and certain. "All right." Calloway looked back at Clara. "Miss Whitmore, I want to ask you something, and I want you to take whatever time you need. There's no rush." He took his glasses off and held them in one hand. "You've had a hard stretch of it. From what I read in this file, you've had more of a hard stretch than most. And now there's a man here who'd like to be your father legally. So tell me, what makes Silas Boone your father? In your own words." The courtroom was quiet. Clara had prepared for this. She'd been turning it over for weeks. She'd had answers ready. Reasonable, honest answers about the ranch and the care and the consistency of it, about the deed and the letter and the people who showed up. She looked at Silas, who was sitting straight in his chair with his hands on his knees and looking back at her with that arranged calm she'd learned to see underneath. She looked at Rosa in the front bench, who had her hands folded in her lap, and was watching with the expression of someone who has already decided how this ends and is just present to witness it arrive. She looked at Mia, who was sitting so still that it was almost physically painful. Mia, who was constitutionally incapable of sitting still and was managing it now by what appeared to be sheer force of will, and who was looking at Clara with an expression of transparent, earnest hope that 12-year-olds generally don't know they're making. She looked at Calloway. "Because when everyone else abandoned me," she said, "he stayed." She hadn't planned that sentence. It arrived complete, and she said it, and it was the truest version of everything else she might have said. The distillation of 4 months of mornings and evenings and cornbread and latched doors and a horse named Frank with a terrible name and a man who stopped his horse in the desert and waited with his hand out and didn't ask for anything back. It was also not quite complete. She knew that. Staying wasn't all of it. Staying was the beginning. The rest of it was smaller and less sayable. The way he moved through a room without making her feel watched. The way he'd told her about June without dressing it up. The way he'd said yes before she'd finished asking. The way he was still here sitting in that chair when nothing obligated him to be. But he stayed was the part that mattered most. Because she'd been left before, and she'd survived it, and she knew the difference between the two now with her whole body. Calloway wrote something. He wrote for what seemed like longer than the sentence required. "That'll do," he said quietly. He picked up his pen and signed his name at the bottom of the document in front of him, and the clerk came forward and added the official seal, and the welfare officer signed the confirmation, and Devereaux signed where Devereaux needed to sign, and the whole thing took about 4 minutes, which seemed like not nearly enough time for what it was. Calloway looked up. "The adoption is granted," he said. "Clara Whitmore. From this date, you are legally Clara Boone." He held her eyes for a moment over the top of his glasses. "Welcome to a new chapter, young lady." She nodded. Her throat had closed up in the way it did when she wasn't going to cry, but her body was considering it seriously, and she was winning the argument by a narrow margin. Silas stood up from his chair, and Clara stood up from hers, and there was a moment in the middle of the courtroom where neither of them quite knew how to close the distance. He was not a demonstrative man, and she was not yet fully accustomed to being held. And then she crossed the remaining space, and his arms came around her, and that was that. He held on. She let him. Behind them, Mia made a sound that was trying to be dignified, and wasn't. And Rosa said something low in Spanish that wasn't translated for anyone. And Hector clapped once and stopped because no one else was clapping, and he'd misjudged the moment. Clara stood in the middle of the ridge-cross courtroom with her face against her father's coat and felt the solid weight of him and thought about the desert and the wagon and the buzzards and the hand held out over the cracked red earth. She thought about how close the margins had been. 1 degree of difference in the direction she'd walked, 1 day more before Silas had turned his horse south. And she didn't follow that thought all the way to the end because there was no point in it. The margins had been what they were. She was here. The carriage ride back to Boone Hollow Ridge took just under an hour, and Mia used most of it to tell Clara about a book she'd been reading that she thought Clara should read next, partly because it was good, and partly because she wanted someone to argue with about the ending. Clara said she'd read it. Mia said good. Then she went quiet for a few minutes, which was unusual, and then she said, without looking at Clara, "I'm glad you stayed." "I didn't have a lot of options at first," Clara said. "You had options later," Mia said. "You stayed anyway." Clara looked at her. There was something in Mia's face that was older than her usual expressions, more deliberate. She'd thought this through, this thing she was saying, which meant it mattered to her. "Yeah," Clara said. "I did." Mia nodded, satisfied, and went back to the window and her book. They came into the ranch through the gate in the early afternoon, the cold light flat and silver across the yard, and the hands were waiting. Not formally. It wasn't a formal thing. But Hector had apparently spread the word before he'd left that morning, and there they were, 5 of them on the porch. And when the carriage came through the gate, someone let out a sound that was half a cheer and half just a loud exhale of relief. And one of the younger hands knocked his hat against the porch post in what might have been celebration. Clara stepped down from the carriage and looked at the porch, and felt something that she was going to have to think about for a long time before she had a name for it. It had to do with being claimed, with the distinction between being tolerated and being wanted, with the difference between a place that keeps you and a place that wants you there. She'd spent 3 years in a house that kept her like a problem to be managed. She knew what that felt like in the walls, in the air, in the way the rooms arranged themselves around her absence rather than her presence. This was different. This was the walls knowing her name. Rosa went inside immediately to start the kitchen. She'd been planning a meal for today the way she planned things she considered important, with extra time and strong opinions. And the hands dispersed back to their work, and Silas went to see about Frank, because Frank had thrown a shoe 2 days ago, and Silas had been worrying about it with the quiet, focused worry he brought to all livestock concerns. Clara stood in the yard for a moment by herself. The ranch was what it was, functional, plain, not pretty in any deliberate way, the kind of place built entirely around what it needed to do, and unconcerned with anything else. The house needed paint. The bunkhouse roof had a section that was going to require attention in the spring. The fence on the east pasture still made that sound in the wind. She looked at it all. She looked at the south porch where she and Silas sat in the evenings. She looked at the stable where Dell had pushed her warm nose into her palm on the first real morning. She looked at the cookhouse window, where the lamp was already on, and the shadow of Rosa moved behind the glass. She thought about her father and the letter in her coat pocket. She thought about him in the last fever days, trying to build something out of words and a land deed and a stranger's name, trying to reach forward through his own dying into whatever came next for her. He hadn't been able to know what she'd walk into. He'd just done what he could and trusted the next step to find itself. It had, badly and expensively, and at significant cost to her. But it had. She thought, this is what it means to still be here. Not triumph, not a clean ending where all the damage is healed and all the accounts are settled. Evelyn was in Santa Fe serving time, and Clara felt about that what she felt, which was unresolved and probably would be for years. The 40 acres in Colfax County were hers, and she'd need to make decisions about them eventually, decisions a 14-year-old couldn't make alone, decisions that would require trust and probably lawyers and probably some hard conversations. She still had nights when she woke with her hand near the latch. She still sometimes caught herself going small in a room when she didn't need to, fading out of spaces reflexively, the habit older than the reason for it. Those things didn't end because a judge signed a paper. She knew that. She wasn't waiting for them to end. What she was doing was living forward past them, one step and then the next, in a place that had room for her actual self, the cautious parts and the stubborn parts, and the parts that were still figuring out how to accept something without calculating the cost. That evening, after dinner, Rosa had made 3 dishes and a cake, and the hands had been invited in, and Mia had given a toast that was both touching and slightly too long. Clara went out to the south porch. The night was cold and clear, the stars enormous, and present the way they only got out here, far from the light of any town. She pulled her coat around herself and sat on the bench and looked at the desert and the sky and let the quiet of the ranch come in around her. She heard the screen door and Silas came out and sat on the step the way he always did, and they were quiet together in the way they'd gotten good at. After a while he said, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "Sure?" "Yes." He nodded. He looked at the desert. "Your father," he said slowly, like he'd been working up to it. "He seems like he was a good man." Clara looked at the stars. "He was," she said. "He made mistakes. He married Evelyn, that was a bad mistake." She stopped. "But he tried to fix it from where he was. He tried to protect me from inside a situation he couldn't get out of." She paused. "I think he did the best he could with what he had." "That's all any of us manage," Silas said. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not angry at him anymore." "Were you?" "For a while." She said it plainly, because it was true and because he would understand it. "For dying. For leaving me with her." She looked at her hands. "I was angry at him. And I felt terrible about being angry at him, and the two feelings made each other worse." "Makes sense," Silas said. "I know it wasn't his fault." "Doesn't always matter whether it's someone's fault." "No," she said, "it doesn't." They sat with that for a while. "I think he'd be glad," Silas said. "About today." Clara looked at the sky. She let herself think about it honestly. Her father, who had rough hands and a low laugh, and had pressed a letter into her palm and made her say a name 3 times. And what he would make of this cold December night on a porch in Arizona with the stars out and the desert doing its enormous indifferent thing, and a man sitting on the step who had turned his horse south for no particular reason and changed everything. "Yeah," she said, "I think he would." She reached into her coat pocket and felt the edge of the letter, that familiar pressed corner. She held it and didn't take it out. There was a version of this where she stayed sad about it forever, and part of her would, she knew that. The way you know that certain things mark you, and the mark doesn't disappear, it just becomes part of the map. Her father was gone, and that was true every day, regardless of what else was also true. But the other thing was also true. She was Clara Boone now, on a porch in the cold, with a man who had stopped his horse for no reason except that the buzzards were circling, with a woman inside who never closed the kitchen to her, with a girl who taught her things she didn't need to know and was glad she'd stayed, with a ranch that had her name in its air now, or was starting to, the way a place starts to hold the people who live in it honestly. She was here. She was still here. Silas stood up after a while. "Cold," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to stay out a few more minutes." He looked at her. He had that look again, the one she'd stopped being able to look at directly. But she looked at it now, held it for a second, let it be what it was. "Okay," he said. He put his hand briefly on the top of her head, the way she'd once seen him do with a young horse that was still learning to be still. Not condescending, just present, just, "I'm here." And then he went inside. The screen door swung shut behind him. Clara sat alone on the porch in the December cold and looked at the desert and the sky and the fence line and the stars. And she breathed the cold air in and out, and she thought about all of it. The wagon and the road, the buzzards and the cracked red earth, the man with the water and the cook with the careful hands, and the girl with the rope, the letter, and the courtroom and the name signed at the bottom of a document. She thought, survival is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the harder part. The harder part was learning to want things again, to trust the floor not to fall away, to accept warmth without bracing for what it cost. To let people call you by a name and believe they mean it. She was still in the middle of that. She expected she would be for a long time. But she was in it. She was present in her own life in a way that she hadn't been in years, maybe ever, that way of being fully inside your days rather than surviving them from a distance. It was not comfortable always. It was not resolved. It was complicated and occasionally painful, and some mornings still required effort to believe in. It was hers. She took the letter out of her pocket. She held it in the cold air, the paper gone soft from handling, her father's writing on the front. She didn't open it. She knew it by heart now anyway. Every line, every slight shake of the handwriting, every word he'd reached for and chosen. She pressed her thumb against the corner of it, one step, then the next. The stars burned above the desert, and the night held everything she'd put into it, and Clara Boone sat on the porch of her home with her father's last words in her hands and let the cold settle around her and thought, I made it to the next step, and the one after that, and the one after that, and here I am. She stayed on the porch until she was too cold to stay any longer, and then she went inside. The lamp was still on in the kitchen. It was always on. That was something she had learned about this place, one of the first things, before she'd learned the horses' names or the hands' faces or which pot Rosa kept the cornmeal in. The light was always on when she came in. She had not known, until she stopped having it, how much that particular thing mattered. How much of what a person needs is not dramatic at all. Not rescue, not justice, not resolution, but just this. A lit room, a warm house, someone who left the light on because they expected you back. She hung her coat on the hook by the door. She was home.